I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence about what kind of story this is, because the title suggests something that might make you expect drama of a specific kind, and I want to make sure you understand what actually happened before we get to the part that everyone is going to want to talk about. Nobody was hurt. I want to say that clearly and early. The logging truck driver was fine. My farm employees were fine. I was fine. And yes, even the person whose Tesla was parked in front of my farm gate on a Tuesday morning in September was physically unharmed. The Tesla, however, was not fine. And the reason the Tesla was not fine is a story that begins not with a logging truck, and not with a gate, and not with a Tuesday morning in September. It begins 3 years earlier with a woman named Constance Hale, a homeowners association that had no authority over my property, and a systematic campaign that had been treating my working farm as if it were a nuisance to be regulated rather than a legal agricultural operation that had existed for 47 years before the first house in the adjacent development was built. This is a story about consequences, not manufactured consequences, not revenge in the sense of something planned and executed for maximum impact. Natural consequences, the kind that occur when someone makes a decision without understanding the full physical reality of the situation they have put themselves in, and the physical reality arrives whether they are ready for it or not. My name is James Whitfield. I am 61 years old. I have operated Whitfield Farm on Briar Creek Road for 23 years, having purchased it from the Donnelly family who had worked the same land since 1971. The farm is 112 acres of mixed operation, timber on the eastern 40 acres, hay and pasture on the western 60, with the farmhouse and outbuildings in the middle. The eastern timber acreage is managed through a rotation harvest arrangement with a regional logging company called Cascade Timber Services, which sends a truck approximately twice a year to take out the designated harvest sections and process them at the mill 40 minutes north. The farm gate is on Briar Creek Road. It is a functional agricultural gate, 12 feet wide, heavy steel pipe construction, mounted on concrete posts that have been in the same location for 31 years. The gate opens to the farm road that runs through the property to the timber acreage. The farm road is the only vehicular access to the eastern timber sections. There is no other way to get a logging truck to the harvest area. This fact, the physical reality of a single access point through a 12-foot gate, is the entire foundation of what happened on that Tuesday morning in September. The Briar Creek Estates development was built on land immediately north of my farm's northern boundary. The development broke ground 8 years ago and was completed in phases over 3 years, eventually comprising 44 homes on lots ranging from 3/4 of an acre to 2 acres. The development was marketed, as these developments always are when they are adjacent to agricultural land, with language about rural character and pastoral setting and proximity to working farmland, as if the farmland were an amenity rather than a commercial operation that had been there decades before the development was conceived. I did not have significant problems with Briar Creek Estates residents for the first 5 years of their existence. The farm produced the normal sounds and smells of agricultural operation, and most of the residents either accepted this as part of the rural setting they had chosen or found it less bothersome than they had feared. The HOA sent me 2 courtesy letters in those 5 years, one about dust from the farm road during dry months, and one about noise from the hay baler during harvest. I responded to both with polite explanations of normal agricultural operations, and the letters stopped. Constance Hale moved into the development in year 6. Constance was in her mid-50s, recently retired from a career in corporate compliance, and had purchased one of the larger lots on the south side of the development, which was the side closest to my farm. Her rear property line was approximately 200 feet from my northern fence line. She had a clear view of the farm's north pasture and on harvest days of the farm road and the gate on Briar Creek Road. She had opinions. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after she moved in. It was addressed to me and copied to the Briar Creek Estates HOA board and it expressed concern about the air quality impact of farm dust on adjacent residential properties and requested that I implement a dust mitigation program for the farm road. It cited EPA air quality standards and referenced several studies on agricultural dust and respiratory health. I read it with some care because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. The letter was well organized and precisely written. The citations were real. The concern, while not something I had the legal obligation to address, was at least grounded in actual studies rather than made up. I wrote back. I explained that agricultural operations on agricultural land were subject to state right to farm protections that provided significant immunity from nuisance claims related to normal farming activities. I explained that I performed annual dust suppressant application on the farm road and would continue to do so. I said I appreciated the concern, but that I was not able to modify my farming operations based on adjacent residential preferences. The response was a second letter, more detailed, with more citations and a formal request through the HOA for a meeting. I attended the meeting. It was a board meeting at the Briar Creek Estates community room, attended by Constance, 4 board members, and 2 other residents. I sat at the table and listened to Constance present her concerns. They had expanded from dust to include noise from farm equipment, smell from the cattle in the north pasture, and what she described as the visual disruption of agricultural equipment visible from her rear windows. I said, clearly and politely, that my farm had been in operation since before the development existed, that agricultural operations were protected by state right to farm law, that I welcomed good neighborly relationships, but was not going to alter my farming practices to suit the preferences of adjacent residential development. Constance said, the HOA has the authority to address impacts on community quality of life. I said, the HOA has authority over its member properties. My farm is not a member property and is not subject to HOA authority. She said, we will look into that. I said, please do. They looked into it. Their HOA attorney confirmed what I had said. My farm was not subject to HOA authority. This was the correct answer, and it did not slow Constance down at all. What followed was a campaign conducted through every channel that did not require HOA authority. State Environmental Agency complaints about dust and odor, both reviewed and closed without findings. County Planning Department complaints about alleged unpermitted structures, reviewed, inspected, closed without findings because all my structures were properly permitted. A nuisance complaint to the county attorney's office that was declined for lack of legal basis. Each complaint required my response. Each response required documentation. I kept records of everything, not because I expected to need them, but because I am a farmer and farmers document things, because the business of farming generates documents, and the discipline of keeping them organized is something you develop whether you want to or not. I also kept records of the complaints specifically as a separate file, because by the 4th complaint in 6 months, I had understood that I was dealing with a sustained campaign rather than individual concerns, and that a campaign needs to be documented as a campaign. My farm attorney, a woman named Louise Hargrove, who specialized in agricultural law and who had been handling farm legal matters in this region for 20 years, reviewed the complaint history at my request. She said, James, this is a common pattern with agricultural residential boundary disputes. The residential side sometimes tests every available mechanism, hopping one of them produces leverage. None of these complaints have merit because your operation is protected under right to farm and your structures are permitted, but they will keep coming unless something changes the calculus. I said, what changes the calculus? She said, usually one of 2 things. Either the complainant eventually runs out of energy, or something occurs that makes the cost of continuing higher than the cost of stopping. I said, how long does running out of energy typically take? She said, years, sometimes indefinitely. I said, and something that changes the calculus. She said, that depends on circumstances I cannot predict. I said, keep the file current. She said, always. The complaints continued for 2 more years. Environmental Agency, County Planning, County Health, a formal petition to the State Agriculture Department alleging unsound farming practices, which the department reviewed and found to be completely unfounded. 14 complaints in total over 3 years, 14 investigations or reviews, 14 closures without findings. 14, everyone documented. The file was substantial. The logging schedule was set in July of year 3 of the campaign. Cascade Timber Services and I had agreed on a September harvest of the eastern section, a routine rotation cut of approximately 8 acres of mature timber. The logging truck, a fully loaded 40-ton vehicle operated by a driver named Ed Kowalski, who had been doing this run twice a year for 6 years, would arrive at the farm gate at 7 a.m. on Tuesday of the second week of September. I notified the relevant county offices of the harvest as required by state forestry regulations. I posted the required signage on Briar Creek Road indicating timber harvest activity and oversized vehicle access. I confirmed the schedule with Ed. I did not notify Constance Hale. I had no legal obligation to notify her. The harvest was a normal agricultural operation on my property, properly permitted and properly signaged. That Constance might object to it was not information that required my response in advance. I learned later, from a conversation with a Briar Creek Estates resident named Tom Garfield, who was not aligned with Constance, and who told me what he had seen, that Constance had become aware of the harvest schedule somehow, possibly from the county public notice that timber harvest activities generate. Tom said Constance had been agitated about it for the week before the Tuesday in question. She had apparently convened a gathering of similarly minded residents and had made statements about the harvest being an opportunity to force the issue of farm road access and timber truck traffic as a community quality of life matter. Tom said she had talked about blocking the gate. I did not know this when I woke up at 5:30 on Tuesday morning and drove to the farm gate at 6:30 to meet Ed's truck. Ed's truck arrived at 6:58, a full-sized logging truck, loaded with the equipment needed for the harvest operation, 40 tons of vehicle and machinery moving at responsible logging road speed down Briar Creek Road toward the farm gate. The farm gate was blocked. Constance Hale's white Tesla Model S was parked directly in front of the gate, not on the road shoulder, not adjacent to the gate, directly in front of it, centered, positioned with the precision of someone who had parked there deliberately and with intention. Constance was not in the car. She was standing approximately 30 feet away on the road shoulder with her phone, recording. I was standing at the gate when Ed's truck came around the last curve of Briar Creek Road and the scene became visible to him. I watched the truck. Ed had seen the situation. The brake lights were on. I want to describe the physics of this situation carefully because it is important and because the physics are what determined everything that followed. A fully loaded logging truck weighing 40 tons, traveling at the legal speed limit for a rural road, approaching an agricultural access gate with a driver who has seen an obstruction and has applied brakes, does not stop the way a passenger car stops. It does not stop the way a pickup truck stops. It does not stop the way any vehicle most people have driven stops. The combination of mass and momentum that defines a 40-ton vehicle in motion creates a stopping distance that, on a rural road surface in September conditions, with full brake application from a driver who responded immediately upon seeing the obstruction, was going to be what it was going to be. Ed applied his brakes. The truck slowed. The truck continued to slow as every foot between the truck and the Tesla disappeared. The truck stopped. The front bumper of Ed's logging truck was 18 inches from the rear of Constance's Tesla. 18 inches. I had watched this happen from the gate with the specific frozen stillness of someone who is watching physics unfold and has no ability to alter them. Ed's driving and Ed's brakes had done what they could do given what they had to work with. 18 inches. Constance, who had been recording from the road shoulder, had stopped recording at some point during the truck's approach. She was now standing very still. The phone was at her side. Eid climbed out of his truck cab. He walked around to the front of the vehicle. He looked at the distance between his bumper and the Tesla. He looked at me. He said, "James." I said, "Eid." He said, "That is not a lot of room." I said, "No." He said, "I need to get through that gate." I said, "I know." We both looked at the Tesla. We both looked at Constance. I walked over to where Constance was standing. She had the expression of someone whose plan had encountered a reality it had not fully anticipated. I said, "Constance, Eid needs to get through the gate." She said, "This truck is a hazard to the community." I said, "Eid is a licensed commercial vehicle operator conducting a legal agricultural operation on properly permitted farm property. The signage required for oversized vehicle access is posted on Briar Creek Road. You have parked your vehicle in front of a farm gate in a manner that creates a hazard." She said, "I am documenting a community safety issue." I said, "You are obstructing access to private agricultural property. I need you to move your vehicle." She said, "I am not moving until the HOA board arrives. I have called them." I said, "The HOA board has no authority over my farm gate or this road. I need you to move your vehicle." She said, "I am standing my ground." I looked at her. I said, "Constance, the logging truck needs to get through that gate. Eid needs to do his job. Your vehicle is blocking him. If you do not move it, I am going to call the county sheriff and report a vehicle obstruction of agricultural access." She said, "Call whoever you like." I called the sheriff. I want to tell you what happened in the 40 minutes between my call to the sheriff and the deputy's arrival, because those 40 minutes are important and because they contain the second surprise that the title references, which was not the truck. Constance had been standing her ground with the confidence of someone who believed that her stated intention, documenting a community safety issue, gave her legal standing to do what she was doing. It did not. Standing your ground is not a legal concept that covers parking your car in front of someone else's gate on a public road. Eid had returned to his truck. He was a professional, and he understood that the situation needed to be resolved through proper channels before he could proceed. He was also, I noted when I checked on him, a calm man who had been driving logging trucks for 22 years and who had the specific patience of someone who had encountered obstacles before and knew that obstacles either get removed or they get around. The HOA board members arrived in 2 separate cars about 15 minutes after Constance's call to them. 3 board members, including the board chair, a woman named Patricia Morse, who I had interacted with twice before on the complaint matters and who I had found to be reasonable when she was not being managed by Constance. Patricia looked at the truck. She looked at the Tesla. She looked at the 18 inches of clearance between them. She looked at Constance. She said, "Constance, what is the plan here?" Constance said, "We are documenting the hazard posed by this vehicle to our community and demanding that the farm operator provide a safety impact assessment before logging activities proceed." Patricia said, "We have no authority to demand anything of the farm operator. The farm is not in our HOA." Constance said, "We are here as community representatives." Patricia said, "Constance, there is a 40-ton truck 18 inches from your car." Constance said, "I know, that is the hazard I am documenting." Patricia looked at her for a moment. She looked at me. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I apologize for this situation." I said, "The sheriff is on the way." She said, "I am going to recommend to Constance that she move her vehicle." She went to Constance and had a conversation I could not fully hear, but the substance of which I could infer from Constance's posture and Patricia's hand gestures. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes. Constance did not move the car. The deputy arrived at 7:42. Deputy Sheila Watkins was a woman I had met once before at a community meeting about agricultural road access issues, and who had the practical directness of someone who spent her days resolving situations that should not require law enforcement to resolve. She looked at the scene, she looked at the truck, she looked at the Tesla and its position relative to the gate, she looked at Constance. She said, "Is this your vehicle?" Constance said, "Yes." Deputy Watkins said, "Are you aware that you have parked in front of an agricultural access gate on a public road?" Constance said, "I am documenting a community safety hazard." Deputy Watkins said, "You are obstructing access to private agricultural property and creating a road hazard. You need to move your vehicle." Constance said, "I am standing my ground." Deputy Watkins said, "Ma'am, you need to move your vehicle." Constance said, "I want to speak to your supervisor." Deputy Watkins said, "You can speak to my supervisor after you move your vehicle. Right now you are obstructing a road and blocking access to private property. Move the vehicle or I will issue a citation and have it towed." Constance said, "You cannot tow my vehicle." Deputy Watkins said, "I can and I will move the vehicle." Constance moved to her Tesla. She got in, she started it, she began to pull forward to clear the gate. And this is where the second surprise occurred. The Tesla, in pulling forward to clear the farm gate, encountered a drainage dip in the road surface immediately in front of the gate that existed because farm gates and drainage dips are common companions on rural roads where water management is a practical consideration. The dip was approximately 4 inches deep and 3 feet wide, the kind of thing that a farm truck navigates without noticing and that a low-clearance passenger vehicle navigates slowly and carefully. Constance did not navigate it slowly and carefully. Constance was flustered and annoyed and pulling forward with the kind of accelerator pressure that people apply when they are making a point about being forced to move, and the Tesla's front end dropped into the drainage dip at a speed and angle that was, given the Tesla's low ride height, not compatible with the geometry of the situation. The front bumper made contact with the road surface. Not a devastating contact, not a collision. The front lower fascia of the Tesla scraped along the road surface as the vehicle bottomed out in the drainage dip. The sound was specific and unambiguous. The kind of sound a car makes when its nose meets the ground and the ground is not willing to accommodate the meeting. Constance pulled forward and cleared the dip and stopped on the other side. She got out and looked at the front of her Tesla. The lower fascia was damaged, scraped. A section of it had separated from its mounting points on the right side and was hanging at an angle that was clearly not its intended orientation. The underside of the vehicle had also made contact with the lip of the dip. The extent of that damage would require a mechanic to assess. Constance looked at her Tesla, she looked at the drainage dip, she looked at me. I said nothing. Deputy Watkins said, "Ma'am, are you all right?" Constance said, "My car." Deputy Watkins said, "The road has a drainage feature. The gate access road has standard agricultural drainage. Are you physically all right?" Constance said, "The farm operator is responsible for this." Deputy Watkins said, "The drainage feature is on the public road right-of-way, which is county-maintained, not privately maintained. Are you physically all right?" Constance said, "Yes." Deputy Watkins said, "Good. I am going to issue you a citation for obstruction of agricultural access and creating a road hazard. I will also need your insurance information in case the road conditions are something you wish to pursue with the county." The gate was now clear. Ede pulled his truck forward through the gate with the focused attention of a professional who had been patient for 40 minutes and was now doing his job. I watched the truck pass through the gate and proceed down the farm road toward the timber acreage. I watched it until it was out of sight. Then I turned back to the scene on Briar Creek Road. Deputy Watkins was writing the citation. Constance was on her phone. The 3 HOA board members were standing in a cluster looking uncomfortable. Patricia Morse caught my eye and made a small gesture that I interpreted as an apology. I acknowledged it with a nod. I went back to the farm. The first surprise had been the truck stopping 18 inches from the Tesla. The second surprise was the drainage dip. Neither of them was something I had arranged or planned or anticipated. The truck stopped because Eid was a skilled driver and physics, while Relentless had cooperated with his braking distance this time. The drainage dip was where it had always been, where it would always be, a practical feature of an agricultural gate entrance that had existed for 31 years. Constance had parked her Tesla in a spot she had not fully understood, on a road she had not fully assessed, in front of a gate whose physical context she had not investigated. She had parked with the confidence of someone taking a position rather than the caution of someone understanding a situation. The situation had introduced itself. I went back to the farmhouse and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what had just happened. The citation, the Tesla's bumper, Eid's truck clearing the gate, the harvest proceeding. I called Louise. She said, "James, I heard the sheriff was out at the gate." Word moved fast on Briar Creek Road. I said yes. Constance parked her Tesla in front of the gate. Eid's truck had to make a full brake application. He stopped 18 inches from the car. Louise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is everyone all right?" I said yes, and then Constance pulled forward to clear the gate and bottomed out in the drainage dip. Front bumper damage. Another moment of quiet, then Louise said, "James." I said yes. She said, "The citation." I said, "Obstruction of agricultural access and creating a road hazard." She said, "And the drainage dip damage." I said, "County road right-of-way." The deputy noted it. She said, "Constance is going to claim you are responsible for the drainage dip damage." I said, "The drainage dip is on the county right-of-way." She said, "I know, but she is going to claim it anyway." I said, "Let her claim it." Louise said, "I want you to document the drainage dip today. Photographs, measurements, the standard approach, before anything changes." I said, "I have already taken photographs." She said, "Of course you have." She said, "James, this morning changed the situation." I said, "How?" She said, "Constance has now been cited by a deputy sheriff for obstruction of agricultural access. That citation is on her record. The HOA board was present and witnessed the situation. The Tesla damage, however it is ultimately attributed, is a consequence of a decision she made. The campaign she has been running for 3 years has now produced a public incident with official documentation." I said, "What does that mean practically?" She said, "It means the calculus has changed. The cost of continuing the campaign is now higher. There is a citation. There is a car with a damaged bumper. There is an incident on Briar Creek Road that everyone in the development knows about. This is the kind of visible consequence that sometimes causes people to reassess." I said, "Do you think Constance will reassess?" Louise said, "I think some of the people who have been following her lead might." I said, "And Constance herself?" She said, "I think Constance is going to escalate before she reassesses. That is the pattern with people who are certain they are right. The first response to a setback is to push harder." I said, "What does pushing harder look like from here?" She said, "An attempt to hold you responsible for the Tesla damage, possibly an expanded complaint to a state agency, possibly a civil claim." I said, "Let her push harder." She said, "I know, I just want you to be ready." I said, "Louise, I have been ready for 3 years." She said, "Yes, you have." She said, "Keep the documentation current." I said, "The file is already updated through this morning." She said, "Of course it is." End of part 1. Part 2. HOA Karen blocked my farm gate with her Tesla, then my 40-ton logging truck didn't stop in time. The Tesla damage assessment came back from the dealership service center at $11,400. I know this because Constance sent me a demand letter 3 days after the incident through an attorney named Brian Calloway, who handled personal injury and property damage cases. and who had apparently agreed to take her case on the strength of her description of events, which I suspected did not include the full physical context. The demand letter alleged that I was responsible for the Tesla damage because the drainage dip constituted a hazardous condition at my property access point that I had failed to address, and that her vehicle had been damaged by this hazardous condition. I forwarded it to Louise. She called me within the hour. She said, "The drainage dip is on the county right-of-way." I said, "I know." She said, "The county maintains the road and the right-of-way. Any hazardous condition on the county right-of-way is the county's responsibility, not yours." I said, "I know." She said, "She is going to have a very difficult time establishing your liability for a condition on county-maintained property." I said, "What is our response?" She said, "I am going to draft a response that declines liability, explains the county right-of-way situation, and attaches the photographs you took of the drainage dip, with measurements showing it is within the standard right-of-way. I am also going to attach the deputy's report from Tuesday, which notes the drainage feature and its location." I said, "Deputy Watkins noted the location specifically." Louise said she did. "In the report it says the drainage feature is located within the county road right-of-way, standard agricultural access drainage, not on private property. That note is going to be very useful." She said, "James, I also want to address the broader situation in the response." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The demand letter is premised on the idea that you are responsible for hazardous conditions at your gate, but the gate was blocked by Constance's vehicle, which was cited for obstruction. The damage occurred when she moved her vehicle under direction from a deputy sheriff. I want to make sure Calloway understands the full sequence of events." I said she was moving because she was cited for obstruction. She said she was moving because a deputy ordered her to move after citing her for obstruction. The decision that put her vehicle in the position where it was damaged was her decision to park in front of the gate in the first place. If she had not parked there, she would not have needed to move through the drainage dip. I said, "Causation." She said, "Yes. The cause of the damage is the decision to park in front of the gate, not the existence of a drainage dip on the county road." I said, "Does Calloway understand that?" She said, "He will after I respond." The response went out Friday. It was 4 pages. It declined liability on the grounds of county right-of-way. It documented the sequence of events with reference to the deputy's report and the citation. It made the causation argument Louise had described, and it noted that any civil claim Constance filed would need to address the predicate obstruction citation and the question of whose decision had placed the vehicle in the location where it was damaged. Calloway called Louise on Monday. The conversation, which Louise described to me afterward with the measured satisfaction of someone who had made a correct legal argument to someone who now understood its correctness, was brief. He had done his own research on the county right-of-way question over the weekend. He had confirmed that the drainage feature was within the county-maintained right-of-way. He had reviewed the deputy's report. He had reviewed the citation. He told Louise that he was reconsidering his client's case. Louise said she understood, and that if Constance wished to pursue the claim formally, she was welcome to do so, and that we were prepared to defend it completely. Calloway said he would be in touch. He was not in touch again. The citation hearing was 2 weeks after the incident. I was not required to attend, but I wanted to be present. The hearing was in the county traffic court before a magistrate named Judge Helen Park, who handled the routine citation docket with the efficient patience of someone who reviewed dozens of cases per session and had a reliable ability to distinguish the straightforward from the complicated. Constance had retained Calloway to contest the citation. She had, based on Louise's intelligence from county court filings, argued that the obstruction was a protected act of civil expression and that the citation was retaliatory. I want to tell you what Judge Park said when she heard this argument, because it was the most precise and economical judicial statement I heard during the entire 3-year period. She said the public road is not a venue for civil expression at the expense of legally established agricultural access. The citation is upheld. Fine is $250 plus court costs. That was it, 2 sentences. Constance paid the fine. The HOA board requested a meeting with me 2 weeks after the citation hearing, not through Constance. Patricia Morse called me directly and said the board wanted to discuss the situation and the future of the relationship between Briar Creek Estates and Whitfield Farm. I said, Patricia, I am willing to meet. I want Louise Hargrove present. She said, of course. The meeting was at the community room again. This time it was Patricia and 2 other board members without Constance. I asked about Constance's absence. Patricia said, Constance is no longer on the HOA board. She resigned last week. I said, I see. Patricia said, the events of the past month have prompted the board to reassess our approach to the farm relationship. I said, tell me what that means. She said, it means we are aware that we have been receiving and sometimes forwarding complaints that did not have a solid basis, and that this pattern has put us in a position that is difficult to defend. We are not proud of that. Louise said, the complaint history spans 3 years and 14 separate filings. What has changed? Patricia said, perspective. And frankly, watching a 40-ton truck brake to a stop 18 inches from a board member's car because she parked in front of an agricultural gate was a clarifying moment for all of us. Louise said, what is the board proposing? Patricia said, we want to establish a formal communication protocol between the HOA and Whitfield Farm that allows genuine concerns to be raised through a structured process and avoids the complaint cascade that characterized the past 3 years. We also want to acknowledge formally that the farm's operations are legally protected and that the HOA has no regulatory authority over them. I said, a formal acknowledgement. She said, in writing, in the HOA records, distributed to all homeowners. Louise looked at me. I said, what else? Patricia said, we want to discuss the timber harvest schedule going forward so that residents are aware of logging truck access dates in advance, not to approve or deny them, just to be informed. I said, I am willing to provide advance notice of harvest dates as a courtesy, not as an obligation. She said, understood. I said, the 14 complaints, what is the board's position on those? Patricia said, they were filed in good faith based on resident concerns. We are not in a position to apologize for the process, but we acknowledge that the volume and focus of the complaints directed at your farm were disproportionate and not consistent with our intended use of the complaint mechanism. Louise said, that acknowledgement, can it be more specific? Patricia said, how specific? Louise said, specific enough to be useful if the pattern resumes. Patricia looked at the other 2 board members. They had a brief exchange I could not fully hear. Then Patricia said, we can document in the HOA records that the complaint history directed at Whitfield Farm between specific dates was reviewed by the board and found to be disproportionate in volume relative to the findings, which were uniformly no violation found. Louise said, that is acceptable. I said, Patricia, I want to ask you something directly. She said, go ahead. I said, the morning at the gate, Constance called the board members and you came. Did you know what her plan was when you came? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, she told us she was going to document the safety hazard of logging truck access on Briar Creek Road. She did not specifically say she had parked her car in front of the gate. I said, when you arrived and saw the truck 18 inches from her car. She said, I understood immediately that this was not what I had been told it would be. I said, and? She said, and I told her to move the car. She did not. The deputy told her to move the car. She eventually did. I said, and when she moved it and bottomed out in the drainage dip. Patricia said, I felt that we had been led into a situation we should not have been in. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry for that. I said, I know. We talked for another 40 minutes about the communication protocol and the harvest notification process and the formal acknowledgement language. Louise took notes. By the end of the meeting, we had agreed on the terms of a written protocol that Patricia said the board would formalize and distribute to homeowners within 30 days. Louise and I walked to our cars afterward. She said, that was more productive than I expected. I said, Constance's resignation changed the board's position. She said, the 18 inches changed the board's position. I said, yes. She said, James, can I ask you something? I said, ask. She said, the drainage dip, did you know it was there? I said, the drainage dip has been at the gate entrance for 31 years. I drive through it twice a day. She said, did you know Constance was going to move forward through it when the deputy ordered her to move? I said, I knew she needed to move forward to clear the gate. I knew the drainage dip was in front of the gate. Beyond that, I did not know anything. She said, but you did not warn her about it. I said, Louise, she parked her car in front of my gate. She blocked a 40-ton logging truck. She was cited by a deputy sheriff. She was ordered to move her vehicle. At what point in that sequence was I supposed to provide her with a road navigation advisory? Louise said, I am not suggesting you should have. I am asking what you knew and when. I said, I knew the drainage dip was there. I did not know the Tesla's ride height relative to the dip's depth. I did not know whether it would be an issue. Louise said, but you knew it might be. I said, I knew the dip was there. She said, and you said nothing. I said, she parked in front of my gate, Louise. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, all right, let me know if Calloway gets back in touch. He did not. The harvest was completed over 4 days. Eid and his crew took out the designated section of the eastern timber, processed the logs at the roadside, and the truck made 3 additional passes through the gate over those 4 days without incident. Each time Eid drove through, the gate was clear. Each time he passed the spot where the Tesla had been, nothing was there except road and drainage dip and the normal passage of a working farm. Tom Garfield, the Briar Creek Estates resident who had told me about Constance's pre-incident statements, stopped by the farm gate on the 4th day as Eid was completing the final load. He leaned against the fence and watched the truck maneuver with the genuine interest of someone who had grown up near farm country and still found the machinery interesting. He said, quite a week you had. I said, yes. He said, that truck is something. I said, Eid knows his business. He said, 18 inches. I said, Eid knows his business. Tom said, half the development watched that video Constance shot. I said, what video? He said, she was recording when the truck came in. She posted it on the neighborhood app before she understood how it was going to look. I said, how did it look? He said, like a woman who parked her Tesla in front of a logging truck's gate and then was surprised by the logging truck. I said nothing. He said she took it down after about an hour, but people had already shared it. I said, I see. He said, James, most of the people in the development did not know the full history of the complaints. Constance talked about the farm as a nuisance issue at HOA meetings, but she did not share the full complaint file or the outcomes. I said, no. He said, when the board sent out the acknowledgement letter, the one Patricia told you about. I said, they sent it. He said, I read it. 14 complaints in 3 years, all closed without findings. I did not know it was 14. I thought it was maybe 3 or 4. I said, 14. He said, the people in this development chose to buy houses next to a farm. I have always thought that meant accepting what a farm is. Not everyone in the development felt that way. I said, I know. He said, there are fewer of them now. I said, good. He watched Eid's truck complete its final load preparation. He said, beautiful piece of machinery. I said, yes it is. He said, must be something to stop that thing in 18 inches. I said, Ed knows his business. Tom said, he does. He walked back down Briar Creek Road toward the development. Ed finished his preparation and came to find me for the sign-off on the harvest completion documentation. Ed said, clean job. I said, yes. He said, about Tuesday. I said, yes. He said, I want you to know that stop was at the edge of what I could do, if the road had been wet or if she had been another 10 feet closer to the gate. I said, I know. He said, 31 years I have been driving. I have never had someone park a car in front of a gate I was approaching. I said, no. He said, I hope it does not happen again. I said, the board has been informed about harvest dates going forward. He said, that helps. I said, Ed, thank you for your driving. He said, that is the job. He completed the sign-off. He drove the truck out the gate for the last time that season, through the cleared road, past the spot where the Tesla had been, down Briar Creek Road toward the highway and the mill 40 minutes north. I locked the gate. I stood at the gate for a moment and looked down Briar Creek Road in both directions. The road was empty. The development was quiet in the afternoon. My farm was behind me, the timber section complete, the rest of the land doing what it always did. I had been farming this property for 23 years. Before me, the Donnelly family had farmed it for 24 years before that. The gate had been in this location for 31 years. The drainage dip had been there for 31 years. The road had been a road since before any of the development's houses were built, since before the development was planned, since before any of the people who now lived in those houses had arrived on Briar Creek Road. The farm was here first. I want to close by telling you about something that happened 6 months after the Tuesday incident, because it is the thing that told me something had actually changed rather than just temporarily shifted. Patricia Morse came to the farm, not with a complaint or a concern or a request. She came because she said she had driven past the farm every day for 2 years and had always been curious about how it worked and had never thought to ask, and she was asking now. I gave her a tour. The hay fields and the north pasture where the cattle were, and the equipment buildings, and the eastern timber section where Ed's crew had worked in September, the section growing back already with the pace that well-managed timber land grows back. At the timber section, she looked at the new growth coming up between the stumps and said, "How long until this is ready to harvest again?" I said, "This rotation, about 15 years. We manage it so a section is ready every 2 to 3 years across the full 40 acres. She said, "So the truck comes through every 2 to 3 years?" I said, "Yes, with advance notice now." She said, "I want you to know that the notice protocol has been well received by the residents who are concerned about the trucks." I said, "Good." She said, "Most of them just wanted to know in advance. They did not want to stop the harvest." I said, "I know." She said, "Constance wanted to stop it." I said, "Yes." She said, "She is not on the board anymore." I said, "I know." She said, "She is also not on Briar Creek Road anymore." I said, "I did not know that." She said, "She sold in February, moved to the city. I think the incident affected her more than she let on." I said, "The Tesla." She said, "Among other things." We stood at the edge of the timber section and looked at the new growth coming up through the October light. A farm works in long cycles. The timber that was planted in the section next to us would be ready for harvest in 15 years. The hay fields would be cut and baled 4 times next summer. The cattle would calve in spring and go to market in fall. The gate on Briar Creek Road would open and close 10 times a day, 100 times a week, 3,600 times a year, as it had opened and closed for 31 years. The farm had been here when the development was built. The farm would be here after many of those houses had changed hands and many of those residents had moved on. The drainage dip would be at the gate entrance where it had always been, doing the work that drainage dips do for as long as the road needed draining. Patricia said, "It is a good piece of land." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for showing me around." I said, "Come back in spring. Carving season is something to see." She said, "I will." She drove back up Briar Creek Road toward the development. I went back to the farmhouse and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and updated the file. 14 complaints over 3 years, 14 closures without findings, 1 citation, 1 damaged Tesla, 1 guilty plea to obstruction, 1 board acknowledgement, 1 communication protocol, 1 resignation. 1 farm still here, still operating, the gate clear and the road open, and Eads number in my phone for whenever the next harvest rotation came around. The farm was here first. The farm was still here.